Most people know Colin Firth as the proud, awkward Mr. Darcy or the stuttering King George who conquered his own voice. But the man behind those iconic roles has been living a private nightmare that Hollywood never saw coming. At 65 years old, the award-winning actor is facing a reality so devastating that it's rewriting everything we thought we knew about his life. And the tragic twist? Nobody saw it coming. On the surface, Colin Firth had it all. By his 50s, he'd won an Academy Award, a Golden Globe, and earned the kind of respect from peers that money can't buy. The King's Speech had made him a household name. He was the thinking woman's heartthrob, intelligent, sophisticated, magnetic on screen. In interviews, he spoke about his wife Livia Giugioli with warmth. They'd been together for over a decade. They had 2 beautiful sons. Magazine covers showed them as the picture of marital bliss. But here's what nobody realized: behind every red carpet appearance, every award show smile, and every perfect family photo, Colin Firth was living a double life. In 2018, something shifted. Rumors began circulating in Hollywood whisper networks about Colin's personal life. But the actor remained silent, compartmentalizing his world with the same precision he brought to his roles. He was a master of concealment, trained by decades in the craft of playing someone else. His friends didn't fully know. His colleagues didn't ask. The public had no idea. He kept the walls up so carefully that even people closest to him couldn't see the cracks forming. What makes this moment so tragic is that Colin Firth had spent his entire career exploring human vulnerability on screen. He'd played men struggling with shame, with identity, with the weight of secrets. In The King's Speech, he portrayed a man learning to find his authentic voice. Yet in his real life, he was silencing his own. By his early 60s, the pressure was building to a breaking point. The compartments he'd so carefully built were starting to collapse. And soon, he would face a choice that would force everything into the light, whether he was ready or not. In December 2018, Colin Firth made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his life forever. After nearly 2 decades of marriage, he and Livia Giugioli announced their separation. The statement was brief, carefully worded, professional. It shocked many who'd followed his career, but the real shock, the thing that would redefine everything, was still hidden. For years, Colin Firth had been grappling with his sexual identity. He was a gay man living in a heterosexual marriage. The weight of that reality, the constant performance, the impossible balancing act between his public persona and his private truth, it had finally become unsustainable. He couldn't keep playing a role in his own life. What makes this tragedy so profound is the context. Colin Firth came of age in an era when being openly gay in Hollywood was career suicide. He built his empire during decades when the industry demanded heterosexuality as a prerequisite for leading man status. By the time acceptance began shifting, he was already locked into a life that had become a prison of his own making. He had a family he loved. He had commitments. He had created an entire existence built on a foundation that didn't match who he actually was. The separation papers were filed, but the real crisis was internal. At 58 years old, Colin Firth faced the terrifying prospect of coming out. Not just to the world, but to himself in a way he never had before. The man who'd spent his career mastering the performance of emotion was about to confront emotions he'd been running from for decades. Friends reported that during this period, Colin became withdrawn. The usual warmth seemed dimmed. He threw himself into work, his escape mechanism, his safe space. But even acting couldn't provide refuge anymore. Because this time, he couldn't pretend to be someone else. He had to finally be himself. The tragedy wasn't just personal. It was existential. Colin Firth had sacrificed his authentic self at the altar of a career, a marriage, and a carefully constructed image. And now, as he entered what should have been the peaceful years of his life, he was starting from zero. Here's where the tragedy deepens in ways that complicate everything we might initially think. Colin Firth's marriage to Livia Giugioli wasn't a lie built on deception. By all accounts, he genuinely loved her. They had created a real partnership, real children, real moments of authentic connection. But love and truth don't always align perfectly. And that's what made this so devastating for everyone involved. Livia is an Italian film producer, intelligent, accomplished, creative in her own right. She wasn't some accessory to Colin's image. She was a person he chose, someone he built a life with, someone he wanted beside him. The cruelty of this situation is that Colin's struggle with his identity wasn't about a lack of love for her. It was about a fundamental truth about himself that he'd been unable to fully embrace while married to a woman. When they separated, it wasn't acrimonious in the way celebrity divorces often are. There was no public scandal, no leaked texts, no messy courtroom battles played out in tabloids. Instead, there was something quieter and somehow more heartbreaking, a mutual recognition that they couldn't continue. Livia deserved a partner who could love her fully, without the shadow of an unresolved internal crisis. And Colin deserved the chance to finally be honest about who he was. But the collateral damage was immense. Their two sons, caught between two parents, adjusting to a new reality, processing their own confusion and hurt. Colin faced the guilt of disrupting their lives, of being the reason their family structure changed. No amount of love between parents can shield children from that pain completely. What's particularly tragic is the timeline. Colin waited until his late 50s to confront this. Decades of his life were already lived. Years with Livia that were built on an incomplete version of the truth. Time with his children spent partly divided, partly distracted by internal conflict he couldn't name. And there's another layer, the public narrative. When Colin's orientation eventually became known, some people judged him harshly. They saw him as a man who deceived his wife. What they didn't understand was that Colin had been deceiving himself most of all. He was the primary victim of his own closeted life. Colin Firth's tragedy is inseparable from the world he inhabited. He didn't come out in a vacuum. He came out as one of the most recognizable actors in the world, a man whose face had been on billboards, whose private moments were currency for tabloids, whose personal life was considered public property. In 2017, before the separation was even announced, a man allegedly hired by Russian operatives tried to infiltrate Colin's home in Italy, posing as a watchdog trainer. The incident was clearly threatening, clearly political, connected to Colin's previous support of Ukrainian refugees and his vocal criticism of Vladimir Putin. But what it revealed was something darker. There were people willing to violate his sanctuary to attack him. Privacy wasn't a luxury Colin Firth could take for granted. It was a battle he had to fight constantly. Against this backdrop, imagine trying to come to terms with your sexual identity. Imagine needing space to process, to grieve, to explore, to heal, while knowing that every step would be documented, analyzed, judged by millions. Most people get to figure out who they are in private. Colin Firth had to do it under a microscope. The entertainment industry had been kind to him in many ways, but it had also demanded a price: conformity, image control, the careful curation of a public persona that bore only partial resemblance to the man behind it. For decades, that was survivable. But as he aged, as his internal conflict intensified, the performance became unbearable. He couldn't compartmentalize anymore. What's particularly cruel is that Colin Firth had spent his entire career championing authenticity through his roles. He'd played men struggling against systems that tried to silence them. He'd won an Oscar for portraying a man overcoming shame. Yet in his actual existence, he was trapped in exactly that cage, silenced, ashamed, performing for an audience that didn't know the real script. The media scrutiny that followed was relentless. Every detail became a story. Every statement was analyzed for hidden meaning. His relationship with his ex-wife, his relationship with his sons, his career choices, all of it became fodder for speculation and judgment. The very fame that had brought him success became a prison preventing him from healing quietly, from making mistakes privately, from becoming himself without an audience watching. By 65, Colin Firth had paid the price that many LGBTQ+ individuals pay when they delay coming out: decades of emotional exhaustion, fractured relationships, and the permanent loss of years that could have been lived authentically. The human brain has remarkable capacity for compartmentalization. We can be one person at work, another at home, another with our closest friends. But there's a psychological limit to how many versions of yourself you can sustain before something breaks. Colin Firth reached that limit. For nearly 2 decades, he maintained separate existences. In one, he was the devoted husband, the family man, the romantic lead in films. In another, he was wrestling with a truth about himself that contradicted everything his public life represented. The cognitive dissonance of living this way doesn't just cause stress. It causes a kind of slow fragmentation of the self. Friends who knew Colin during this period describe a man who seemed increasingly distant, even in moments of connection. How could he be fully present when part of his mind was always managing the lie? How could he be genuinely intimate when intimacy required vulnerability he wasn't allowed to have? The compartmentalization that had once felt like strength, the ability to separate his professional and personal lives, became a form of self-imprisonment. What made it worse was that Colin was acutely aware of what was happening. He's an intelligent man, trained to understand human psychology through his craft. He knew the cost of living inauthentically. He'd studied it, portrayed it, won awards for depicting it. But knowing something intellectually and being able to change it are two different things entirely. Understanding the cage doesn't automatically open the door. There's a particular tragedy in watching someone you respect slowly disappear inside themselves. His colleagues noticed subtle shifts, moments where the warmth seemed forced, where the charm felt performed even off camera. His family felt the distance, even if they couldn't name it. His children grew up with a father who loved them deeply but couldn't fully show up, because part of him was always hidden. The separation in 2018 was the moment those two lives finally collided. The compartments couldn't remain separate anymore. Everything that had been carefully divided suddenly had to merge into one messy, complicated, painful reality. Colin Firth had to become a whole person, but that meant grieving all the years he'd spent fractured. And here's the heartbreaking part: even after the separation, the healing wasn't simple. You can't spend decades living a double life and expect to suddenly integrate into wholeness. The damage is structural. The patterns are deep. He had to learn, in his late 50s and 60s, who he actually was beneath all the performances. In September 2022, Colin Firth did something that seemed to come out of nowhere to the casual observer, but made perfect sense to anyone paying attention. He publicly confirmed what had been whispered in Hollywood circles for years: he identified as gay. The announcement wasn't dramatic or defiant. It was quiet, matter-of-fact, the way you might finally state something obvious after years of pretending it wasn't true. What shocked people wasn't the revelation itself. What shocked them was the timing and the realization of what it meant. Colin Firth had spent nearly his entire adult life, his entire career, living as a closeted gay man. The King's Speech, Pride and Prejudice, Bridget Jones, The English Patient, all of it had been created by an actor who couldn't be honest about who he was. The response was mixed, and that complexity is important. Some people celebrated his courage. Others felt betrayed, as if they'd been lied to. Some criticized him for waiting so long, for not coming out earlier when it might have meant something to younger LGBTQ+ people struggling with their own identities. But what these critics didn't understand was the impossible position Colin had been in. By the time Colin came out, he was already 62 years old. His career was established. He didn't need to come out for professional reasons, he'd already achieved everything. In some ways, coming out at that stage was harder, not easier. He wasn't doing it to launch a career or find acceptance in an industry that had begun to shift. He was doing it because he couldn't live the lie anymore. Because the cost of silence had become higher than the cost of truth. What made this decision particularly devastating was what it meant for his marriage. Even though the separation had already happened, publicly confirming his sexual orientation meant publicly acknowledging that his marriage had been built on an incomplete version of himself. It meant Livia would have to live with the knowledge that her husband had been unable to be fully honest with her. It meant his children would have to process not just their parents' separation, but the reason behind it, played out in headlines. The tragedy here is that Colin Firth made the most courageous decision of his life at an age when most people are supposed to be settled, secure, done with major life upheavals. He had to rebuild his identity, his relationships, his understanding of himself, not in his 20s or 30s when reinvention feels possible, but in his 60s, when change feels like loss. And perhaps most painfully, he had to do it knowing that he could never get back the decades he'd lost. There's a conversation happening in the shadows of Colin Firth's story that rarely makes it into the headlines. It's about the cost of respectability, the price paid by LGBTQ+ individuals who came of age in eras when hiding was the only survival strategy. It's about how we judge people for choices they made in impossible circumstances. When Colin Firth married Livia Giugioli in 2010, he was 50 years old. By that point in his life, he'd already spent 3 decades in an industry where being openly gay could destroy your career. He'd watched others pay that price. He'd internalized the message, loud and clear: your sexuality is a liability. Hide it. Manage it. Build a life that proves you're acceptable despite it. What people don't realize is that Colin Firth wasn't unique in this experience. Countless actors, directors, producers, and industry figures have made similar choices. They married women they genuinely cared about. They had children they deeply loved. They built lives that were real, even if they were incomplete. The difference is that most of them never come out. Most of them take it to their graves. Colin Firth's tragedy is that he couldn't. The internal conflict became unsustainable. But in choosing honesty, he had to accept a kind of loss that most people never experience, the loss of his own biography. He had to publicly recontextualize his entire life, his marriage, his family, as something built on a foundation he hadn't been able to acknowledge. There's also the question of culpability that society loves to wrestle with. Did Colin deceive Livia? Technically, yes. Did he do it intentionally and maliciously? Almost certainly not. He was a man caught between impossible choices, trying to survive in a world that hadn't made space for him to be honest. The tragedy is that good people in bad circumstances often hurt other good people, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. What makes this even more complex is Colin's own evolution. As he's aged and society has shifted, he's had to reckon with decades of choices made under duress. He's had to live with the consequences of a life he didn't fully choose, in an industry and a time period that didn't allow him to. He's had to grieve not just for himself, but for everyone affected by his journey toward authenticity. The deepest tragedy might be this: Colin Firth's story illustrates how the closet doesn't just harm the person hiding. It reverberates outward, affecting everyone connected to them. His wife, his children, even the audiences who watched him on screen, all of them were affected by his inability to be honest. But here's where the narrative shifts, because Colin Firth's story isn't purely tragedy. It's also, in a strange and complicated way, a story of resilience. After coming out in 2022, Colin Firth didn't disappear. He didn't retreat from public life or collapse under the weight of everything that had happened. Instead, he continued working, continued showing up, continued being the professional that decades of discipline had taught him to be. In 2023, he appeared in the film Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. He took on roles that interested him, without the constant pressure of maintaining a heterosexual image. What's remarkable is how he's handled his relationship with his ex-wife post coming out. By most accounts, Colin and Livia have maintained a cordial co-parenting relationship. They're not enemies. They're not locked in a bitter custody battle. They're two people who loved each other, made a life together, and eventually had to acknowledge that the foundation had been incomplete. It would have been easy for either of them to turn this into a public war. Neither has done that. There's dignity in that choice. His sons, now teenagers, have had to navigate a complicated family situation. But they also have a father who, in his 60s, had the courage to finally be honest about who he is. That's a powerful lesson, even if it came wrapped in pain. They're learning that authenticity matters more than image, that it's never too late to become yourself, and that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is finally tell the truth. In interviews since coming out, Colin Firth has spoken with a kind of quiet wisdom about his journey. He doesn't play the victim, but he also doesn't minimize what happened. He acknowledges the loss, the decades spent compartmentalized, the relationships fractured by his inability to be honest, the time he can never get back. But he also seems, for perhaps the first time in his life, at peace with who he is. The strength in this story isn't that Colin overcame tragedy without cost. It's that he faced the tragedy head-on, accepted the consequences, and found a way to move forward anyway. At an age when many people are supposed to be done changing, he fundamentally restructured his existence. That took a different kind of courage than most people ever have to summon. What's particularly poignant is watching him in recent roles. There's a freedom in his performances that wasn't quite there before. An authenticity that comes from finally being able to be himself, at least partially, in a way he never could before. He's living proof that it's possible to transform, even late in life, even at tremendous cost. At 65 years old, Colin Firth is living a life that's messier and more complicated than the one he constructed for decades, but it's also more real. He's still acting, still working at a level that most performers would envy. He's still involved in his children's lives. He's still navigating the relationship with his ex-wife. But now he's doing it as himself, not as a carefully managed version of who the world expected him to be. The tragedy of Colin Firth's story doesn't have a neat resolution because real life doesn't work that way. He can't get back the years he lost. He can't undo the impact of his marriage ending, even though both he and Livia have handled the aftermath with grace. He can't erase the decades spent in compartmentalization, pretending to be someone he wasn't. But he has gained something, the possibility of being whole. What's haunting about his journey is how it reflects a larger tragedy affecting countless LGBTQ+ individuals of his generation. Colin Firth represents a particular kind of loss, the loss experienced by people who came of age when hiding was mandatory, who built entire lives on foundations that didn't match their truth, who had to wait until late in life to finally become themselves. For many, it was too much cost. For Colin, it was a price he ultimately decided he had to pay. His story also serves as a mirror for the film industry itself. For decades, Hollywood demanded that LGBTQ+ actors stay closeted to protect their marketability, to maintain the fantasy for audiences who wanted their leading men to be straight. Colin Firth was a casualty of that system, even though he was one of the lucky ones who eventually escaped it. How many others spent their entire lives in that cage? Today, when younger LGBTQ+ actors talk about coming out, they often do so with relative ease compared to Colin's generation. The industry has shifted. Society has shifted. But that shift doesn't erase what Colin Firth and others like him endured. It doesn't rewrite their histories or heal the wounds of decades spent hiding. What's perhaps most tragic is that Colin Firth is still processing his own story. He's still living with the consequences of choices made in impossible circumstances. He's still rebuilding relationships that were fractured by his inability to be honest. He's still learning who he is beneath all the performances. In a way, his tragedy isn't something that happened to him in the past. It's something he's still living through, every single day. But here's what matters, he's living it as himself. That's not nothing. That's everything.